Hi guys, sorry that I'm not here. I'm going to pick up where one of my classes left off, but if you got past this in the next slide, feel free to just fast forward. For those of us that left off here, you may recall we were talking about the post-industrial landscape and what causes the departure of industries as well as the effects of that. I left off for some classes here talking about how Chicago had managed to fix some of these areas that had been left poor as a result of the departure of industry, as well as a whole bunch of other problems that we don't have time to get into. And part of that is reflected in our landscape with the demolition of public housing projects in Chicago, like you see here, being replaced with nicer housing. This didn't always help people. This sort of makes it seem like some of the poorer people may have moved into these nice townhomes or apartment buildings, and often that was not the case. So there's a lot to be said for the marginalization of the poor in Chicago, despite the fact that some neighborhoods get better. The poor often don't see the benefits of that. So we'll talk about that more in our next unit, but for now, let's just try and play catch up a bit. I don't want to waste too much of your time. So one other factor to consider in how post-industrial landscapes adapt to the changing global economic situation, which is developing countries seem to get a lot of the manufacturing jobs. One thing to talk about is how governments adapt to that. One thing that we haven't talked much about, but it's come up in the news a heck of a lot, is tariffs. Trump with his trade war with China may lead you to at least be familiar with this word tariffs. That's been in the news a lot the last year or so. Tariffs are taxes on imports. So let's say you are a U.S. shoe manufacturer. Your shoes are going to be more expensive to make than shoes made in China for lots of reasons. But one we'll just say is China will have lower wages. So if you want to try and have competitive shoe prices as a U.S. shoe manufacturer, you would hope that the Chinese shoes would somehow end up being priced similar to your shoes. How can this be made more likely? Tariffs. The U.S. government would impose taxes on the imports of these cheaper Chinese shoes, and that would make them more expensive. That would hopefully allow your business to sell more shoes because it would be priced competitively with your competitors. So tariffs are sometimes used by governments to protect local industries. Could be farmers that they protect, could be manufacturers. So in a post-industrial landscape where you've got all these different global competitors, one way you can kind of protect yourself is through tariffs. There are downsides to this. We don't have time to get into those. You just need to know what a tariff is. The alternatives include building landscapes that are geared towards certain types of businesses, like what would be called an office park or a business park. That link takes you to a part of Google Maps. If you look around Schaumburg, I suppose you could go to, check it out on a map. Pause this for a minute and go check out Kato, Schaumburg. Kato or Kato is a Japanese model train maker. I have a friend who works at their office in Schaumburg. So Google that, Kato, and then just drive around their office park. It's not Kato's office park, it's just an office park in Schaumburg. Drive around, see what it looks like. You'll see that you'll find a lot of these features. So once I name these features, you can go and check it out and you'll see what I'm talking about. Office parks generally have a lot of offices, no surprise. So to attract businesses, a town might build an office park or plan an office park so that it can have more tertiary sector workers. You'll often find they have curvy roads. You don't need straight roads. Curvy roads are more desirable. They're more fun to drive around, more scenically or aesthetically pleasing. They'll often have green space. A lot of people who work in offices may not want to be around a really busy area. Green space is always nice. It's relaxing. Some people may go out and take a walk during their lunch break or something. They're often not tall buildings. They're often low buildings. So check those out. I would take you to this link, but then it ends this recording. So just Google Kato Schaumburg, and then just go to Google Street View. Drive around. You'll see what I'm talking about. All these features are common in office parks. You may even know that you've been through an office park at some point and just didn't know it was called that. Industrial parks, on the other hand, are built for industrial purposes. They are very similar to office parks, except in some ways the opposite. You've got, instead of curvy roads, you have straight roads. Why would curvy roads be bad for an industrial park? Well, you'd be having trucks go sideways down roadways, or I should say turning a lot. That might lead to cargo getting moved around in the back of a truck, hopefully not, but straight roads just make it easier for industries to get their jobs done and get their stuff to and from a destination without any extra hassle. Makes it less likely you get into accidents, all this other stuff. You'll end up having larger buildings. Industrial parks are going to have manufacturers, they'll have warehouses, logistics facilities, in other words, used for shipping, so they need way more space than an office building would. Still going to be a low building, but just way bigger. And they probably won't have much office space, or I should say green space, just because the land is going to be used as much as possible for the manufacturing purposes or whatever it's built for. Finally, most importantly perhaps, you'll see that they are often near infrastructure. Highways, railroads. There's some great examples around Chicago. I guess I would just direct you again to Google and just look at O'Hare. Search O'Hare Airport, go to Google Maps and look at, or Google Earth. Maybe that would be better. You just need a satellite view of what's around O'Hare Airport. You should be able to easily spot that O'Hare Airport has all around it, pretty much 360 degrees, it's got a whole bunch of big buildings. Almost all of that would be industrial parks. You can zoom in and find even lots of railroad tracks interspersed among a lot of these industries. Why are they located near O'Hare? Well, the bullet point right above that link tells you. People or businesses that are industrial want to be near highways, railroads, airports. It's like a perfect location. Outside of that proximity to O'Hare, you'll see tons of houses. So it's pretty easy to spot where the industries are in these industrial parks, where the houses are. Houses obviously are way smaller, it's a lot of trees, not so much in an industrial park. So check it out, it's pretty obvious, and if I were in class I'd show you where a lot of these rail lines are, but you might be able to spot them yourself. Drive around and you'll start to see this stuff more and more often. It's pretty easy to spot. All right, last thing we'll talk about, and then we'll get to what you actually read about last night. Growth poles are another factor to consider in the post-industrial landscape. How do you make your town grow again? Well, some places become growth poles. One really good example of this that we've talked about enough in class is Amazon's second headquarters. Amazon's second headquarters was so prized as an employer for a town or a city because it would have offered huge benefits to that city. Even though cities offered huge benefits to Amazon to come to hope to get it to settle in its city, there would have been huge benefits for Chicago. We'll talk a bit about those. Some of those benefits will come from agglomeration. If Amazon had located here, you would have had probably tons of other tech companies want to settle in Chicago and benefit from the talented work pool here. It generates more excitement about the city. More people will find a reason to move here so that they can be potentially able to also attract big name or I should say talented workers. You also often see medical districts will be growth poles. You may not have noticed this. Chicago doesn't have a well-known medical district, at least not if you're not in the medical field. But our medical district is on the near west side of Chicago, where Rush Hospital is. We also have a medical district on the right near the Magnificent Mile downtown, right off Michigan Avenue, where Northwestern's medical school is. We're going to be expanding a medical district on the south branch of the Chicago River. So medical districts are really big deals just because, and there should be a comma here, this doesn't make any sense. Medical districts should be comma tech companies. Oh, I see, I've repeated myself. Ignore the typos in there. It should say often driven by agglomerations of tech companies or medical districts. Forget that last mention of tech companies. Anyway, sorry. The growth of tech companies or medical districts can often be beneficial for a city because that attracts high-tech firms that want to be involved on the cutting edge of medical research. This obviously requires that you've got educational institutions, which are great for a city to have. High-level education institutions attract good people to your city. So all of this can result in growth economically. You've got more taxpayers, you've got more businesses locating here. Even though you may have to give up subsidies or tax breaks to some of these companies, it ends up being hopefully good in the long run. It doesn't always work out that way, but it can be. You'll often find a lot of these growth poles then appear near universities. So the medical district that Chicago is going to have on the south branch of the Chicago River is going to be run by the University of Illinois at Chicago, UIC. There are others. I told you that the one near Michigan Avenue is run by Northwestern. And there are many others you can find around the U.S. outside Chicago, of course. You've heard of Silicon Valley. We've talked about that before. It's a place where you got tons of startups and tech companies. There are really good universities around there. Santa Clara University is well known. There's tons of others, and those universities are now even becoming more tech focused because of the agglomeration of tech companies there. So everything kind of feeds off each other and builds. So it's like growth leads to more growth, whereas we know the opposite can happen. If your city's starting to shrink, that leads to more shrinking. Chicago has been trying to reverse a slow but steady shrinking for a long time, and some of the efforts have paid off and a lot of them haven't. So we still struggle in ways that other smaller growing cities don't. They seem to be growing a lot faster. San Francisco's smaller than us, they're growing faster. Many cities in the US that are not Chicago, New York, or LA are growing fast these days. So these big old cities like Chicago have to find a way to turn it around. We're in a worse position than LA or New York. Financially and for all sorts of other reasons. Our weather stinks. But anyway, growth poles often these days tend to be located in these sort of mid-sized cities. And I wouldn't be surprised if 50 years from now the U.S. population looks very, very different. Places like San Francisco and warmer climate cities like Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Orlando. There's others like Chapel Hill in North Carolina, where you're going to see huge population growth in the future as people tend to move there for the warmer climates, but also lower taxes. That's a big factor for a lot of people. So you've got a research triangle there in North Carolina that involves well-known areas. Chapel Hill is home to University of North Carolina, but you can see these other cities, Durham and Raleigh, are home to some other research that makes their so-called research triangle. And a lot of this can create multiplier effects or the growth of unrelated jobs. So if you attract more medical people to your town or tech people, you're going to need more people to sell shoes and fix cars. And that also creates spin-off benefits for people farther away. Those people need to eat, so that creates more work for dairy farmers and for factory workers in China far away, supplying them with all this stuff. We could go on, but the downside of this is, of course, then that leads to brain drain in other local areas. So maybe you are somebody who lives in this part of North Carolina where it's poor. Now your talent goes somewhere else, or maybe you leave a poor part of Georgia and go to North Carolina. We talked about brain drain months ago in relation to international migration. You know, if the U.S. needs lots of nurses and many doctors or nurses in Africa don't want to work in Africa, they might come here, and that leaves Africa with a deficit of doctors or nurses. The same can apply just on a smaller scale in the U.S., on a national scale or a regional scale, where you end up seeing smaller communities, rural communities, don't have these talented people, and those places start to die. So brain drain can apply on any scale. All right, finally, what I wanted to get to for today, I'll try and make this fast, measures of development. So some of you got this far in our notes, maybe this is where you're starting, but wherever you are, we got to cover this, and I'll make it fast, at least as fast as I can. Measures of development are simply ways that we can numerically track how countries are doing. If I were in class, I would have you discuss this question: is it possible for all countries to reach a high level of development? I think the answer to that, I don't have one. I guess it's possible. But there's two models of development that we'll talk about, one of which kind of proposes that this is possible, and the other one that doesn't. We'll get to those models probably another day, but let's cover these measures of development first. For one, you've got a very well-known measure of economic development that is called the GDP. That stands for Gross Domestic Product. The domestic part stands for stuff made at home. The GDP, as you can see, is the value of all the goods and services produced within a country, domestically, in a year. This is sometimes standardized with what's called PPP. You don't need to know this, but it's what's called purchasing power parity, which just means that if you were to compare country to country to country, of course, we all have different currencies, and the value of goods vary from place to place. So a cheeseburger in New York is going to cost you more than a cheeseburger in rural France or whatever. A cheeseburger in Japan is going to cost you more than a cheeseburger in Rockford. So how do you compare places when you have all these differences? The answer is with purchasing power parity. You don't need to know that, but this allows us to standardize GDP so we can compare country to country how much their economy is worth or how much they're producing in a year. So GDP is, again, within the borders of your country and measures the value of the stuff your economy made in a year. On the contrary, you've got GNP, which is gross national product. This includes the same stuff as GDP, but then you add the international stuff. So let's say you've got for GDP, let's say we talk about McDonald's. They're obviously a transnational corporation, but GDP would not count the money that McDonald's makes overseas, whereas GNP would count the money that McDonald's makes overseas as well as domestically. So this is obviously always going to be a larger number than GDP. There's also this figure GNI, gross national income. This is basically the same thing as GNP. You often see one of these statistics, sometimes it's GDP, sometimes it's GNP, in a per capita form. Per capita just means per person. So like a GDP figure for the US might be like $20 trillion. Like that may be how much our goods and services produce domestically in a year. But if you look at our GNP, it will be a bigger number, maybe $25 trillion. But if you were to make that per person, that kind of gives you an idea of what our income is per person. It's the value of all the stuff we produce per person in a year. So you might see a figure for GNP per capita or GNI per capita, something more like $50,000 a year or $45,000 a year. Again, these are often standardized so you can compare country to country to figure out really how our country's doing and are they growing or shrinking. This also can help us to, I shouldn't say that, another way to analyze an economy we've already talked about, so maybe I'll just skip through this. The sectoral structure of an economy, I guess, is just a quick reminder. You know that more developed countries tend to have more tertiary sector stuff, the developing countries tend to have more secondary sector stuff, and the least developed often have a larger share of their economy as the primary sector. So the US is like 2% primary, about 18% secondary, and 80% tertiary. Another measure of development economically is what's called the Gini coefficient. This was created by an Italian guy. His name was Gini, or Gini. So that doesn't really have much meaning for you, but a coefficient, you may know, is a number between 0 and 1. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about human geocoefficients or some other measure of something, but a coefficient is between 0 and 1. So you're talking about a decimal, and a Gini coefficient is going to tell you how poorly income is distributed. The closer you are to 1, the worse off your country is. The closer you are to 0, the better. So you obviously want a low Gini coefficient. This tells you that there's not a big gap between rich or poor, that there's a lot of opportunities for people across the board. Finally, one thing that you will not find measured in these statistics is what's called the informal or shadow economy. The informal economy is the stuff that goes on outside the reach of the government. So let's say that I sell drugs, or I have a farmer's market stall, and I end up making money through cash. These transactions are not going to be tracked by the government, so they're not going to know how much money I'm actually making. This is still stuff I've produced. Hopefully, I'm not talking about drugs. I don't produce drugs. Maybe in my basement I make like designer hats or something, or I knit things and sell them on Etsy. This stuff is not going to show up in the government's ledger, so they don't know how much I'm making, but it's still part of our economy. And these figures, these informal economies, are a huge part in the developing world, a huge part of the developing world. So lots of people who are just poor, or governments that don't have the ability to track as much as ours does, won't be able to factor in all these little businesses that take place on a daily basis sometimes out in the open, sometimes in shadowy alleys, but it all factors in as part of the economy. Overall, you just can't get every statistic. So the GNP and GDP kind of miss this stuff. If you want to look up an example of the Gini coefficient, just Google it. Find some examples on the internet. See where the U.S. is. Be kind of interesting to see where we rank compared to other countries and who number one is and where some of the worst are in the world. These are the kinds of general things the AP test would possibly ask you about. Other than economic measures of development, there's social measures of development. Some of these will sound familiar, like TFR, total fertility rate. A social measure of development tells you how are the people doing outside of economics. How's their health? How's their education? What about how many kids they have? So obviously that applies to TFR. There's the infant mortality rate we talked about way back in Unit 2. If you have a high TFR, a high infant mortality rate, that's not a good thing, obviously. That shows you that your country needs to develop more socially, so to speak. Literacy rates are a big factor. How many people, or rather what percent of your population can read? Obviously, you want that to be higher. Access to health care. This could be measured a whole bunch of different ways, but one common way that the CIA World Factbook measures it is access to doctors, or number of doctors per 1,000 people. The more doctors you have per 1,000 people, the better, of course. There are various so-called indices of empowerment. Indices is the plural of index. So an index of empowerment is simply another measure of something. In this case, we're talking about gender inequality. This is a really important factor to consider. We know that many countries of the world, including the U.S., don't give women their fair share of a lot of stuff. They don't get treated equally in the eyes of the law in many cases. For example, women seem to not have quite as much of a right as men to control what they do with their own body. All sorts of laws in this country have to do with abortions and all that stuff, right? So indices of empowerment can indicate generally whether a country has more or less equality between males and females. One really popular measure of this is what's called the GII, or the Gender Inequality Index. Pretty straightforward. This statistic includes a bunch of things. So how do you summarize gender inequality in a number? Boy, that would be so hard to do. You'd have to combine so many different statistics, and that's what the GII does. It takes a whole bunch of stuff, jams it all into one number, so that really quickly you can get a basic idea of how a country is doing in terms of gender equality or inequality. This statistic includes, importantly, reproductive health. So this is women's access to services and information related to sexual or reproductive health. So whether that's information about STIs or sexually transmitted infections, or access to prophylactics, whether it's condoms or the pill, access to gynecologists or other doctors that would be able to educate them on best practices and maintaining their health. All sorts of stuff related to women's health is a big factor in gender inequality or equality. Related to this, maternal mortality rate. We may not think about this much at our age, especially if you're a boy, but and in the U.S. Women don't die very often in childbirth in the U.S. In lots of other countries, it's fairly common. Childbirth is a very difficult thing to go through, so I'm told. So the maternal mortality rates can be a very good indication of how fair or equal your country is to its women. Are they really taking care of? Excuse me. Are they really taking care of their women? And obviously, the most important time to do that is during pregnancy. Adolescent fertility rates also are a big factor in this statistic. This is how many births you have per 1,000 women aged 15 to 19. Obviously, you can have children before you're 15, but that's what the statistic focuses on as part of GII. The more births you have per 1,000 women 15 to 19, probably the worse off your women are. They may not have quite as much of access to education. They may not be able to talk to somebody they trust about when to have a child and what to watch out for. Here's just a quick example comparing Europe to Sub-Saharan Africa. Europe's women between 15 to 19 have 19 kids per 1,000 women, whereas Sub-Saharan Africa, they have 110 roughly per 1,000 women. Wow. Another big factor, this is all important, female labor market participation. How much are women actually participating in the labor market? Are they working a lot, or are they staying at home and looking after kids? Are they getting educated and going to get jobs? What kinds of jobs are they getting? And lastly, government representation. Boy, is that important. In the U.S., look up how our female representation in government is right now. I forget what the numbers are, but I think right now we have the highest number of women in the House of Representatives. I could be wrong, don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. So that's a good sign. You want all parties to be participating equally in government, ideally. So if you find governments that don't have much female participation or representation, maybe not a good sign for the women of that country. So all of that goes into gender inequality, as does gender pay gap. Equal pay. Look up where we rank in the Gender Inequality Index. So if you need an example, check it out. Really interesting to see. I'm sorry I'm not there to show you some of this stuff. There's some really cool things to analyze about this. Look at the top, look at the bottom. Where are we? Really interesting trends. Some of them you could probably guess. Lastly, I'll talk about the so-called Human Development Index. Here's an example for the U.S. You can see that we are ranked 15th in the world with a 0.92 coefficient. This kind of tracks our HDI over the last 30 years. You can see HDI includes a whole bunch of stuff. It's so tiny I tried to squeeze it in here. This is a composite. A composite means that it combines a whole bunch of stuff. So far I gave you some economic measures of development, some social measures of development. This one takes social and economic measures. So if you want a decent idea of how a country is overall, not just economically, not just socially, you can look at the HDI. It includes things like health, education, income, inequality, gender, poverty, work, human security, trade and financial flows, mobility and communication, environmental sustainability, demography, socioeconomic sustainability. All of that stuff gets combined. So the things that you need to know it includes for the College Board AP tests, it includes things like GNI per capita, how much money we make. Obviously, that's a huge factor in people's lives. How much money do you make influences a lot of things in your life, as does your health. What's the life expectancy in your country? How much schooling has the average person gone to? So all of that stuff makes up HDI. See who number one is. Make some guesses. I'm sorry I'm not in class because I have some interesting activities for this to see if you can figure it out yourself and make some educated guesses about where some countries rank in the world. But lastly, energy use is to some an important factor to consider in development of a country. If you have more fossil fuel use, that's things like coal, not charcoal, that's wood, but coal, oil, natural gas, that's probably not good for your country because those are dirty. Of course, they contribute to global warming in the long run. But if you have more renewable energy, that can be a sign that you are more developed. Some of the world's most developed countries have lots and lots of renewable energy, namely Germany. The U.S. is a bit behind. Interestingly, the world's #1 producer of green energy, by far, China. They also use tons and tons of fossil fuels, lots of coal, but they're trying to transition away from that. So interesting to see how the world develops, either economically, socially, a combination of that stuff with HDI, or you could look at things like energy use. All of this relates to development. This is where we'll end for today. Sorry that I'm not here, but hopefully this stuff made sense. And email me if you have some questions. I think you've got what you need to crush that reading quiz. So if you haven't taken it yet, take it now, take it again, crush it, and I'll see you guys next class. Thank you. Bye.